I'm Nick Knutson, the executive director here at DemCast. We are a 501c4 nonprofit organization dedicated to lifting up digital grassroots digital voices on the left, defeating MAGA extremists online by empowering you all to use your social media accounts strategically to spread messaging that's helpful to democracy. We are very excited about having Tom Bonier on with us today. I wanted to really quick just plug before we get to Tom. For those of you who don't know, DemCast is now using the Reach app. So there's an app that you can get on your phone. You can also use a web-based version. And Reach is just a really cool tool that enables you to share content really easily from your phone or desktop computer. We are constantly updating the app with, Jamie just put the join link in chat. We're constantly updating the Reach app with new content based on the day's news events, based on just new content that's coming out. Peggy said it best. Reach is so easy. I can use it, and I'm a technical idiot. So, and also one of our very best and most beloved Demcasters. So we love you, Peggy. But no, it's great, and we're trying to build community on there. It's got chat spaces where we can all sort of like hang out and get to know each other and talk about messaging, and so we're super excited about it. We're trying to get we're approaching 400 people in our Reach group. Goal of maybe hitting 1,000 by early May, and we've got some volunteer events coming up that we're hopeful where we'll get a lot of folks signed up. So just share it around, share it with your friends, encourage people who you know online who have active social media accounts to join us over there. It's just another, if nothing else, it's just another resource where you can get really good content to share on your social media. That's helpful to our cause. Okay, without further ado, Jamie, you want to go ahead and introduce our esteemed guest?
I would love to. I'm so excited about this. Anybody who has been on our calls know I love data and spreadsheets. And so I actually have Tom on notifications because I love his insight. So for those of you who don't know, Tom is a veteran political strategist currently serving as the CEO of Terra Group and a senior advisor to Target Smart. For 30 years, he has worked at the intersection of data and technology with a focus on gaining actionable insights to solve big problems. He has worked with organizations, campaigns in all 50 states, and he is recognized as a pioneer in the introduction of big data, particularly in the progressive space. And so the reason I'm so excited about this call is because Florida gave us a gift last week. That was my first thought, and want to hear from the experts. But we know Florida Supreme Court, the same time they're banning abortion, it goes to the people of Florida to decide. And this could be a game changer for 24, for the presidency, for the U.S. Senate, for House seats, for state House, state Senate seats. So Tom, take it away. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I was really excited to have the opportunity to join y'all. And thank you all so much for the work you do. Very much appreciated. It's great to see a great group of folks getting together on a Monday night in April to talk politics. So very much appreciated. Yeah, Florida, I'm with you, Jamie. Part of me was thinking that the court was somehow going to try to find a way to punt on this, because what Republicans do know, or at least they're certainly waking up to, and I think we saw this with Donald Trump's awkward sort of announcement this morning, is they've recognized the organizing power of abortion rights in politics. And going back to 2022, that election was incredibly instructive, and I think will have a lot of bearing on what we see and why I'm optimistic that this puts Florida in play. Because, we saw this mixed bag in the 2022 elections. To be clear, we all remember what happened. The expectation, not just based on what the polls and pundits were saying, but based on historical precedent. The expectation was that Republicans were going to have a massive red wave sweep election where they would win massive margins in the House and the Senate, up and down the ballot. As we all know, that didn't happen. But it was, and my friend Simon Rosenberg says this better than anyone, where he talked about the two elections. It's really the best way to think about it. There were two elections, as he says, sort of inside the battleground, outside the battleground. I like to add to that, really inside the battleground is where abortion rights and Republican extremism was on full display and was perceived as a stake in that specific election. And interestingly, Florida was not one of those states. Not because Republicans are an extremist in Florida, but because voters didn't see an opportunity. There wasn't a connection between the act of voting in those elections and having an impact on abortion rights and then stopping Republican extremism. The race wasn't perceived as competitive. In the end, it wasn't. But what we did see is the places where Democrats overperformed, where abortion rights was either literally on the ballot, like Michigan. And I'd like to talk about Michigan a little bit more because I think that's probably the best example that we can look to when we ask the question about what happens in Florida.
Our Michigan people will appreciate it.
Good. Well, I'm a big fan of what they've done there. So, and having spent time, I met my wife working on the campaign in Michigan in the 2000 election, to date myself. So, so you had this dynamic with states like that, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Nevada, where Democratic turnout was actually quite good. Florida, the Democratic turnout in Florida, and I hate to be negative, but this will turn into a positive, I promise. Democratic turnout in Florida in 2022 was the worst it has been in generations. It was just abysmal. Democrats didn't turn out. But what's happened is I think people looked at that, and there's been this narrative that Florida is trending Republican. But we just have to go back to 2018 when you look at that governor's race when DeSantis first ran, where he won by the narrowest of margins. You look at Senator Rick Scott, who has won twice by very narrow margins there. Florida is a competitive state when Democrats organize and turn out. Again, Democrats didn't really have a reason to turn out in 2022. So Florida looked like basically everywhere would have looked like absent the Dobbs decision. So what does that tell us? Well, when you think about Dobbs, one of the lessons from 2022 is that it's not a magic wand. It doesn't change everything everywhere, right? You have to do the work. We have to make it clear what is at stake. The Florida State Supreme Court has done that for us. It is literally at stake because abortion rights is on the ballot. So we think of the limited examples of where abortion rights has been literally on the ballot. I mentioned Michigan. We know Kansas was the first state. Kansas set a record for turnout in a primary election, the highest turnout they've ever had in a primary election. It was the first test of the Dobbs decision in the first week of August. It was just 5 weeks after the Dobbs decision was handed down. It was the first electoral test. More people voted in that midsummer, usually sleepy primary election in Kansas than voted in any midterm general election up to that point, other than the 2018 election, to show you how many people voted because of abortion rights. Then we saw what happened in Ohio last year with that ballot initiative, where they set a record for turnout in an odd year election. What we haven't seen much of is this intersection where you have abortion rights amendments on the ballot during a general election. The biggest and most prominent example, again, is Michigan. And we all know how well that election went for Democrats. Governor Granholm won easily. Democrats picked up the trifecta there. But as an example that jumps out to me, if you look at the polling in Michigan had Governor Granholm winning by an average of, I think, about 4 points. If you look at the 538 average, it's still online. Someone can check it, but it was about 4 points was their prediction. She won by over 11 points, meaning the polls missed in Michigan by a wider margin than almost any other state. And it was a state that had lots of polls because it was considered to be competitive. Why was that? Was it because the polls themselves were not great? Well, yes, like in the aggregate, obviously the polls weren't great. But what did they miss? They missed this wave of pro-abortion rights voters coming out to vote. So we're going to see lots of polls between now and election day in Florida that will likely suggest that Republicans are doing better than they will do. So I think it's going to be a reminder to all of us as we look forward to this election and think about the potential work we can do there. And as you mentioned in the intro, it's not just the presidential race. It's so many opportunities up and down the ballot there. Again, Senator Scott's seat, it's state legislative seats, it's competitive congressional races. This almost certain surge in Democratic turnout fueled by abortion rights voters will put these races in play.
And I'm curious of how marijuana on the ballot too is going to affect that. Because that just seems like, something nobody had on their bingo cards to have abortion and marijuana on the ballot at the same time. They have 5 months of living under some of the strictest abortion bans in the country. So you're getting these personal stories coming up. But I mean, I'm Utah, and in 2018, we flipped this House seat because marijuana was on the ballot.
Yeah,
I mean, it's the easiest thing to register voters here of, hey, so I'm just curious of how you think those two are really going to affect the youth vote.
Well, what's interesting is we have that precedent from last year in Ohio. Ohio had that combination on the ballot where they had those two initiatives. In the cannabis amendment incrementally outperformed abortion rights. They both won by massive margins, I think around 17 points, which when you think Ohio is a substantially more Republican state at this point, which is weird. It pains me to say it because Ohio should be a battleground state too, and has been not that long ago. But when you look at presidential performance, statewide performance, Ohio has been more red than Florida. Yet the abortion rights amendment and the cannabis amendment prevailed by almost 20-point margin. So I think in Florida, it's reasonable to assume that we will see both of those carrying by even wider margins. And to your point, to the extent that one of the concerns that we've seen in the data at this point is some weakness in the youth vote, some discontent with the president. Again, it's early. It's not something that I look at and I say that's permanent. It just shows that we have organizing work to be done. And I'm confident that that work will bring those voters home when the stakes of this race is clear. But in a place like Florida, it certainly helps to have those two issues, the two most powerful issues proven in the ballot box in terms of increasing youth turnout have been abortion rights and marijuana legalization. So to have both of those, to your point, was not on my bingo card. It certainly wasn't on the Republican Party's bingo card, and I'm sure they are scrambling. And they're not happy because this means they've got to spend a lot of money and resources in Florida. And as we know, they don't have a lot of money and resources at this point. It's not something that we should sleep on and assume that everything's going to be fine. They'll find the money. But a sign of their grassroots weakness, frankly, is that they haven't been raising the money, and they will need a lot of money to hold on to Florida.
Yes, and there was a question in chat of, do you think the votes would translate to the top of the ticket?
Yeah, so a great question, because it is an important caveat that not everyone who supports abortion rights and cannabis legalization is going to vote Democrat. Like in Kansas, for example, on that race, that ballot initiative that I mentioned, our estimates are about 25% of registered Republicans in Kansas voted no, which was the pro-abortion rights position. It's a little bit skewed because, as I understand it, some people in Kansas will register as Republicans because that's the only way you can have a voice in the primary elections.
We do that in Utah too.
Right. Right. Yeah, you're familiar with the
So
compromises we
yeah.
have to make sometimes. So, but even in Ohio, we've seen the same thing. You're going to have some crossover, undoubtedly, but there's really the two elements, broadly speaking, um, that we have to consider when we think about the potential impact of abortion rights and marijuana legalization being on the ballot in Florida. One is persuasion, the other is mobilization. And the mobilization impact will help Democrats up and down the ticket. You're going to have Democratic voters, keeping in mind, again, as I mentioned, that a lot of Democrats stayed home in Florida in 2022. So the challenge is, how do we get Democrats who came out in 2020, or even some Democrats who didn't come out, haven't come out at all, who will be voting in their first election? How do we get them to turn out? Well, these two amendments will be helpful. And those voters, they may be drawn out to vote for those amendments. It is very rare, statistically speaking, that people will come out to vote for an amendment and not vote president, Senate, those other races. So it's reasonable to assume that that will have an incredibly positive impact for Democratic candidates. The second impact, as I said, is persuasive. Those are those crossover voters. And no doubt there will be some not insignificant. If these amendments end up at over 60%, which I believe they will in terms of pro-abortion rights and pro-legalization, um, undoubtedly, that means a number of them will vote for Republican candidates. But again, it's why we saw Donald Trump do what he did today with that clumsy video. He's trying to find a middle ground on an issue where we know middle ground doesn't exist. It's not where Americans are, at least not in the way that he framed it. But for him to win, just the simple math, if it's getting over 60% of the vote, it could get 65% of the vote. That means he needs to win a substantial portion of those voters to get them to cross over to vote for him. Maybe 1 in 5 of those voters who vote for it, he'll need to get to cross over to vote for him. Same for Republicans up and down the ballot. That's hard to get people who are pro-abortion rights to get the guy who says that he is responsible for the Dobbs decision. And even in his video today, where he was clearly trying to strategically strike some sort of safe middle ground for him, he couldn't help himself but brag about how he is responsible for overturning Roe v. Wade. So yeah, there will be crossover vote, but the persuasive effect, it won't be zero. I would anticipate that it's going to give Democratic candidates at least, somewhere in the neighborhood of a 2 to 3 point boost, which is significant.
So that puts multiple House seats in play that have been listed as likely or solid red.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think when you look at the map there, um, both, House and state legislative seats, I would expect that we're going to see a much bigger playing field. Now, again, it's about resources, as we all know. And Florida is, there are some parts of the state that are more efficient from a media perspective. But especially when you get into South Florida and the Miami media market, it's not cheap. And organizing, for those who have worked in Florida, will tell you it's a tough state to organize in a lot of ways.
My my understanding, Tom, is that um, there is some concern that even if this isn't something that we want to message out to the masses because we want to drive Florida turnout, but even if the ballot measure passes, that there could be like filibuster proof majorities in the state house and state senate, and of course DeSantis is governor, where they can like kind of undo everything or like tie it up in legislation or in the courts or whatever.
Yeah.
um
Yeah, it's certainly a consideration, and we've seen with this Republican Party, they certainly are not shy about overturning the will of the electorate. I mean, it's interesting because again, Donald Trump said today that the issue should be settled by the states and by the people, and so the hypocrisy that they would then immediately try to overturn the will of the people, but in the end, that's the only path in front of them. Never mind that there's this whole other matter that um, almost half the states don't have the ability for citizens to get ballot measures on the ballot. so it's nice to say that it should be decided by the people, but when the people have absolutely no recourse other than, and this is why I think it's problematic for the Republicans, other than voting out the Republican members of Congress, governors, and senators who are the ones enacting the regressive anti-abortion rights policies in these states.
Right.
Isn't it a little bit harder to undo a constitutional amendment though versus just a law?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the. I would hope so in Florida, but I'm not familiar with that specifically. I think it's safe to say that to the extent that there is some means by which Republicans could overturn the will of people, they'll do it.
Yes, exactly. That's kind of why I brought it up. Like this is something, because this is a social media messaging army that we're communicating with at the moment, and so these are the kinds of things that are going to come up in comment sections, and
Yeah.
as we're trying to motivate people to share messaging about Florida, because everybody's been so down on Florida for so long.
Yes.
And this is a moment of hope, and it's really important to just to be aware of what the counter arguments might be, but
Yep.
but also persist through them.
I
all we
will
can
say,
do all we can do as citizens is what we can do, and the ballot measure is step one, and whatever comes next is the next thing that we're going to have to battle against.
That's right.
I do think that there is. I heard somebody on a call this week saying that where the Florida State Senate is 6 seats. If we flipped 6 seats in the Florida State Senate, then they would not have a filibuster proof majority, or Democrats would have the filibuster in the Florida State Senate, which could help to curtail some sort of countermeasures that they might have. So thinking of Florida as like a whole, not just the ballot measure, not just Joe Biden, not just the Senate race, but lifting up Democrats across the state is going to be really important.
Well, and oh, go ahead.
I have been on a few Florida calls, with Florida Pacific groups, particularly the one that did the abortion. And they said it's not very easy to overturn a constitutional amendment. And it would basically go into effect the day that everybody is sworn in. So I think it's like January something.
Yeah.
And they said it is very difficult to overturn a constitutional amendment versus just a law, like the giving felons a right to vote. So
Yeah,
that was
that's good, but
yeah.
they'll still try.
They'll try.
Right. Well, that reenfranchisement that you mentioned is a great example. I don't remember if that was 2018 when they did that, but that passed by overwhelming margins. And as we saw, while they couldn't overturn the specific amendment, we'll recall what they did is to basically put poll taxes in place to make it effectively not viable. So who knows? I think I think people will remember it wasn't that long ago. It was earlier this year. There was that special election in Florida, the state legislative election, that the Democratic candidate won. Again, it's the same story that we've seen around the country, a massive overperformance. We saw it in Alabama just a few weeks ago. And so I think to your point, Nick, it's going to be on the ballot, not just in terms of this actual constitutional amendment on the ballot, but now it means in these state legislative races, all of these candidates will have to go on the record and do they support a constitutional amendment on abortion rights? Do they support a 6-week ban or not? And I think that's going to put a lot of these Republican incumbent members in a very difficult position based on their track record and what they have voted, because keeping in mind, they are the ones who put these bans in place in the first place beyond what the Supreme Court did. Obviously, they've passed some of the most regressive laws in the country. And so for them to be on the ballot, sharing the ballot with an amendment that will almost certainly exceed 60% support in the state, meaning it will carry most districts, that's hard. Again, the challenge is for the Democratic candidates and for this group and for the activists to make those stakes clear. It's my only concern there is it's a little bit harder to break through in a presidential election. because there is so much noise, especially with Donald Trump. It's so noisy, as we all experience. And that's sometimes why we have to simplify things. And I know this group knows that, is very good at it. But those stakes in Florida have to be clear that abortion rights and the future of abortion rights in the state are very much at stake.
And there is a great question on, states like Michigan, California, New York, where abortion isn't on the ballot. How do you think the turnout will be affected?
Yeah.
Um,
I think this is probably the biggest and most important question that we're going to face because, like I said, in 2022, New York was, there were three states where Democratic turnout really didn't look good at all: New York, California, and Florida. And to me, New York, California, Florida, New York and California were basically in the same boat as perceived blue states. And the idea was abortion rights just weren't going to be at risk no matter what happened. So voters, pro-abortion rights voters, didn't have a reason to flock to the polls like they did in places like Michigan and Arizona and Nevada to produce that overperformance that we saw Pennsylvania. And then again, Florida, it was more just voters not perceiving an opportunity. What I think has changed is the intervening year and a half, now almost 2 years, that we've lived with the Dobbs decision. We've seen them back. We've seen Republicans say what they were going to do, that if Donald Trump wins, I think everyone here is very familiar with the Project 2025, though the Heritage Foundation just took it down from their website, the actual plan, which tells you uh, uh, how much of a liability they realize, but it was up there long enough for all of us to see it. And I imagine everyone's aware. A part of their plan is they said, look, we're losing these ballot initiatives around the country. We saw JD Vance say that after the Ohio loss, where he saw in his state, a Republican state, that abortion rights won by massive margins. He said we have to find another way. And Republicans have been looking for another way on this. Well, the Heritage Foundation and their Project 2025, they say the other way is to simply for Trump to win and for his Justice Department to use the Comstock Act. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, there are some good stories there's been some good reporting on this in the last couple of months. It's still not getting a lot of attention. But it's an act from the 1800s, a law from the 1800s that banned the transport of various things, including the tools of abortion, the means of abortion, by mail. And so what they're arguing is Comstock Act could effectively, with a Republican administration, become a federal national abortion ban. That's their argument. And so, to the extent that this is a clear stake, and I believe it has to be a clear stake, that if we elect Donald Trump president, we will effectively face a federal national abortion ban. Those stakes need to be clear. If we successfully convey that point to the voters in places like New York and California and elsewhere, states where they thought they were safe and that abortion bans were going to be something that we would only see in so-called red states, then I think we'll see an increase in turnout. We certainly saw that in the special election in New York 3, where our candidate certainly leaned in on the issue of abortion rights. After some pushing, but when you look at the advertising that how that broke down, it was very heavily about abortion rights, and it absolutely mobilized Democratic voters to come out in that election. So the fact that it was an effective argument there this time, where in that very same district, that's how we got George Santos, because Democrats just stayed home.
Right.
That's all. So yeah, my belief is that we will see better Democratic turnout and abortion rights will drive it in those places, but it's going to take work still.
And Tom, and that's a great point about the Tom Suozzi race and that being sort of a blueprint especially for blue state turnout, which can especially impact the House and flipping the House back to blue. Um, uh, Jamie, you were about to say something? Was there a question in the chat?
Oh, no, I was actually had something about polling because I saw a poll came out last week that abortion was listed as like the 9th or 10th issue, which kind of made me laugh.
Yeah.
Because I was like, really?
Yeah.
You
That's
know,
one of my pet peeves.
yeah,
We saw that in 2022. Remember, like,
yeah,
Nate and Nate Cohn, I'll give him credit. He and I go back and forth and spar on some things, but I think he does a better job than a lot of the other sort of quote data journalists. And one of the mea culpas he had after the 2022 election was I misread the polling on abortion rights. Because remember, there was all these stories where Dobbs happens June 24th. Kansas happens first week of August. The New York 19th special election happens in a couple weeks after that, where Democrats win that upstate New York seat. Alaska special election happens right after that. Democrats win in Alaska. We come to Labor Day and everyone's looking at it saying a red wave isn't going to happen. Abortion rights has changed everything. And then you had a Wall Street Journal poll and you had a New York Times poll not long after that, post Labor Day, that said exactly, Jamie, to your point, that like, oh, the polling suggests that crime and inflation are more important than abortion to voters. Abortion has faded. Democrats overplayed their hand. And then we saw what happened. Again, the reality is, and look, I'm a big believer in polling. We have a wonderful polling team. Um, it's generally misused and misperceived in the public sector, and the sort of public dissemination of it and how the media takes it. But um, asking people what the most important issue is to their vote, you're going to get that's very noisy data that you're getting. It's people
Mhm.
saying, what they think is what they're supposed to say or what they would like to believe is the most important answer. But in the reality, when we see what is actually impacting the two most important decisions, should I vote or not, and for whom should I vote, nothing is more salient than abortion rights. And the fact is that salience in terms of the data we look at, which is special election results, voter registration data, general election results, ballot initiatives, it is only more salient now than it was in 2022 and is only growing because we have lived experience. We now have almost 2 years of horrific lived experience. We saw the ad that the Biden campaign put out today. I think it was a very good ad, and also heartbreaking and horrifying. But that's the reality around this country. And as people are living this and they're hearing more of these stories, we're seeing the issue grow. And so, for this group, expect to see more of these stories on polling where people say, well, abortion rights isn't a top 5 issue. That's not how you determine the salience of an issue. It's what actually motivates people in those two key decisions. And nothing else is proven to have more of an impact than that issue right now.
So Tom, you had mentioned earlier in the call about wanting to talk more about Michigan and what Michigan did. Could you expand on that? Like what happened in Michigan and how can that be kind of a blueprint for messaging for
Yeah.
sort of path forward in Florida and other states?
Yeah. Well, you see, so just I think everyone's aware, but it was the only state that I can think of now, and I might be missing one, that in the November ballot had competitive statewide elections and um, an abortion rights amendment. It's funny. I was in Michigan a couple of days after the Dobbs decision was handed down. I think it might have been the day after. And I remember literally my foot first hits the ground in Michigan, getting out of my car. I forget the town, somewhere suburban Wayne County. Someone within 2 minutes came up to me with a petition. They were ready to get it on the ballot. They were organized, to their credit. And then they drove it straight through to election day. So one, you had a very organized team around the actual amendment to lean in on the amendment to make sure that it was a messaging vehicle that can be very important and helpful because in a lot of ways it's a bipartisan messaging vehicle, right? It's something that has overwhelming support. But then you had an incumbent Democratic governor in Gretchen Whitmer who was absolutely unafraid to lean into the issue. And that was, and I will give it, at this point in retrospect, it's easier for people to look at it and say, well, yeah, obviously. But at that point, yes, you had the Kansas example. But in terms of that electoral context and what, the so-called smart analysts in the public sector were saying, that was a more risky thing. And Governor Whitmer and her team were fearless with that. They made it a central point of their messaging, but it wasn't the only point of their messaging. They proved what, again, to the point I was making a moment ago about the commentators saying the Democrats had overplayed their hands on abortion, that they should have been talking about the economy and crime and inflation. And Governor Whitmer and Democrats in Michigan in general proved that you can walk and chew gum, that they were driving home a very powerful message on abortion rights, but we're also talking about the so-called, kitchen table, pocketbook issue, so to speak, in a very effective way. And also, the fallacy that abortion rights isn't an economic related message, because it very much is, in a lot of ways. So I think we have a lot to learn from the way they approached it. And what you saw in the end and the result, like I said, the polling showed that to be a pretty close race, a 4 or 5 point race. She was expected to win, but it was expected to be close. It wasn't close. She won by, again, I think almost 12 points. And a big part of that was because she got crossover vote that the polls didn't anticipate, and Democratic turnout was much better than the poll samples were built to predict. The poll samples were built in more of this sort of red wave mentality. I wouldn't be surprised to see something similar happen in Florida and in other places. The other thing that's worth keeping in mind, and I think Michigan was a great example of this, is this general notion of Republican extremism. I think we as Democrats and progressives tried a bunch of different tactics on this. How do we attack Republican extremism? There is psychologically a certain amount of inherent denial in it's just a human thing, right? We want to believe that things aren't really as bad as they might be. That this guy isn't really trying to overturn our democracy, that we aren't headed towards a dictatorship. January 6th happened, and there was sort of national shock and outrage, and then it faded quickly. And you saw this in the polling that, by the time we got around to May and June of 2022, that issue had faded a little bit. And what was interesting to me is when the Dobbs decision was handed down, not only did it have an impact on all these races from the perspective of abortion rights, but suddenly the arguments about democracy and Republican extremism suddenly became more viable and credible. And I think there's a reason for that, because when we've been telling voters for so long that Republicans are extremists, that they're going to overturn abortion rights, that they're going to do these things, I've been working in Democratic politics since the mid 90s. In every campaign, we would talk about, it's about the Supreme Court presidential race. It's about protecting Roe. And I think we got to the point where people didn't believe that Roe would ever be overturned. And then they saw it happen. I think it opened voters to the notion that, okay, there is an element of extremism, that our freedoms are not safe. And so you saw that in Michigan, where they were effectively making the argument about Republican extremism. Republicans have helped us make that argument by continuing to nominate extremely unqualified extremist candidates. And that's where, you saw the biggest impact. That's why, Dr. Oz underperformed the poll so substantially too. Just a woefully unqualified, unprepared candidate who decided to lean into extremism. And remember his comment at the debate about abortion rights being between a woman, her doctor, and local elected officials. Kind of similar to what Trump is saying today, by the way. So yeah, I think Michigan is something that we should all be refreshing our recollection and looking back at that campaign, looking back at how Governor Whitmer leaned into the issue. And I think we'll have a real opportunity in Florida. Obviously, a difference in Florida is we don't have an incumbent Democratic governor, so it's going to rely on a broader community to make that argument.
Are there other states, like stepping back from Florida, or states or races that maybe people aren't super focused in on that we should be?
Mm. It's a great question. I think, there's undoubtedly going to be some of those. And I think for me, I generally start to take that harder look right before Labor Day when you sort of think about that. Where's our last sprint?
Right.
Because there are always going to be some that we missed, like when we think about the House seat in Colorado with
Colorado. I was just gonna say that.
like, and now obviously that's very much on the radar, but who knows if she even wins her primary. I
Right.
mean, from what I've heard, she
Right.
very well may not. um but to me, that's the sort of the environment that we are living in, is because of the effect that Dobbs has had and because of Republican extremism. There are plenty of Lauren Boeberts around the country.
Right.
And so looking at where, number one, um, where will abortion rights be on the ballot elsewhere? And I'm not, I believe Arizona, and I could be wrong about that. I believe Arizona.
Arizona, Nevada, Mississippi, North Dakota. It's actually there seems to be two things on ballot initiatives this year: abortion and democracy issues.
Yeah.
Red states are trying to undermine democracy at ballot initiatives, and other states are trying to expand it. So
Yeah. So I think that's something that we'll need to factor in when we look at where there are some potential pickup opportunities. I hate to get into this, but Eric, there is the news of the day about the Kennedy campaign, and there is the, not to take us off track, but it is relevant to the abortion rights
Yeah.
question, where there was the Kennedy campaign operative in New York talking about how their whole strategy is to deny Biden 270, and so and to throw it to the House. And if it gets thrown to the House, then, as people are likely aware, it's the delegations vote. Arizona is actually the Democrats' best chance to pick up a delegation based on the map. Now they have to pick up 2 seats in Arizona, which is actually quite doable. There's 2 competitive seats. So I don't know that those races, certainly the Senate race, has gotten a lot of attention, and we know the presidential race in Arizona will be hotly contested. But I encourage folks to be paying attention to those House races too. I really hope it doesn't come down to a 269 split, but just as maybe a backup plan, we think about where we can pick up another delegation. Majority in Arizona is our best shot right now. So certainly be paying attention to that. The House is just going to be incredibly competitive. Republicans keep having retirements there. So, I feel good about that. I think the only place where we're probably less likely to see surprises at this point is in the Senate. But again, back to Florida, Scott is not well liked in Florida. He's not well liked anywhere. He'll just get by on party ID, but I think there's a real opportunity to actually take him out. If we win Florida, I don't see a path for Republicans to take back the Senate.
Yeah.
do you think Brown and Tester will be okay?
I believe so. Again, like when you look at what happened in 22, which is I do think it is instructive. For the most part, the incumbents won. There at the Senate and gubernatorial level, there were almost no flips in terms of incumbents running. For the most part, we're still in this dynamic where people, for the most part, don't like members of Congress and elected officials, but they're fine with their elected officials. And so, especially at the Senate level, where you have 2 senators there in Tester and Sherrod Brown, who are just incredibly well known in their states and generally well liked. So I feel better about those races. Obviously the open seat races, potentially more challenging. But I feel good about the opportunity in Florida.
Well, I think
I have seen a few questions about Texas. I think that there's zero chance in Texas.
Yeah, I mean, here's what we can say about Texas is that we know that it is, even though I think we all likely feel frustrated because of the amount of time, effort, energy, and resources that have gone in there. And we worked with Beto O'Rourke in his first run statewide, and I think people feel a little bit, I don't want to say burned, but maybe burned out. But the reality is when you look at the trend there and the trajectory, Texas is getting closer and closer and closer, and we can get there. So we can't give up on it. Doesn't mean that we'll get there this time. I think that's a challenge. But I do think we need to continue to invest in it, because when you look at, we've had the pleasure and honor of working with Stacey Abrams and her team going back to 2014. And so we're very well aware of the work and time and investment that went into the recent successes in Georgia. And it didn't just start in 2018. It started many cycles before that. And so, that work and investment has been happening in Texas. I'd like to see it continue. You never know. I do believe it will flip. I mean, the in-migration trends haven't been super positive there because you've had more conservatives moving from places like California into Texas, but it's still moving in the right direction. Someone mentioned, by the way, where I live, Maryland, in that Senate race, and Larry
I was
Hogan.
just going to say that.
Yeah.
And that's one that yes, there have been a couple polls that showed Hogan actually winning in that Senate race. That's one that I believe, when we get closer to election day, and as Hogan is actually put on the spot, especially on issues like abortion rights, I don't see Hogan winning here in Maryland. That same Washington Post poll that showed him winning, they asked voters which party they wanted in control of the United States Senate, and overwhelmingly, unsurprisingly, they want Democrats in control of the Senate. So I think once people check in on the stakes, I don't see him winning.
Yeah,
I think too, you've got two top tier Democrat candidates.
Yes.
And so you don't have that one person that's out in front right now. You've got the two competing, where,
That's right.
even in the other states like Michigan, Florida, Arizona, technically we don't have a Dem, but we all know who the Dem's going to be.
That's right.
Where Maryland, I don't know which one's going to win.
No, it's a very close primary. That primary is next month. We're 1 month away. So that primary will be decided middle of May, and then that focus will have to be on exposing Hogan.
Yeah,
he's had a bit of a honeymoon as being a guy who will be critical of Donald Trump. But I think once the Democratic grassroots in these campaigns start exposing him for what he is, which is a Republican. He's a Republican who will vote with Trump 90% plus of the time, based on when you look at his ideology. He's not someone who would represent the state well in the Senate. And the fact is, Maryland has a larger African-American population than any other blue state other than the District of Columbia, 33% African-American population, bigger than Georgia even. And so for Hogan to win, he would have to do what he's done in these governor's races, which is win over 20% of the African-American vote. And when you consider the difference in turnout in a presidential year and a midterm, you're talking about almost 400,000 African-American voters who will vote, who have never voted for Larry Hogan before because they've not voted in the previous midterm elections. That'll be tough for him to find an argument that works with these Democratic voters.
I'm glad that the primary is early.
Yes.
Some of these states have like late August primaries.
Maryland used to be later. And I'm originally,
know?
I grew up in Massachusetts, where we used to have our primaries in September.
Yeah.
I think Michigan is pretty late. I think it's like August.
Yeah, that's pretty rough. But I mean, like the the Maryland example underscores like you've got Tester, you've got Sherrod Brown. We get those are must holds. Like we have to hold every
Yes.
seat, every
Yes.
single seat that we can possibly hold. Joe Manchin is
Yes,
gone.
because West Virginia's, yeah,
We have to make sure that
that's
we
it.
retain Arizona. Um, and uh, and Hogan is maybe a long shot threat, but a threat. And so like bringing it back to the beginning of the conversation, like Florida, if there could be a flip, it's probably Florida.
Yeah,
It's like it's our
it's the
best
number one
insurance
opportunity.
policy,
Well,
right?
Yep.
and it's going to force the Republicans to now spend a lot more money than they
Right.
were originally planning in Florida.
Yeah.
Right.
And again, we've seen this going back to 2022 to the last midterm. Republican fundraising numbers were not good. It's one of the reasons that Simon Rosenberg and I were confident that a red wave wasn't coming. The argument was we've seen and experienced red wave elections. We lived through 2010 and 2014. And we know what they look like. One party outraises the other. One party has much better registration numbers. They do better in special elections. And really, the only thing that was somewhat on the Republican side was some of the polling. And we're seeing that continue in really all of those indicators, including fundraising, is Republicans don't have a grassroots donor base at this point. They have some billionaires. We saw this in the Trump campaign announcement yesterday, which we'll see what's real. They claimed to have broken the Biden campaign record and have raised $50 million in one event. We know how Trump likes to overestimate crowd size and numbers in general. We'll see when the FEC reports are out. I sincerely doubt you will see that, but to the extent that you'll see some big numbers, it's going to be some of these billionaires who are putting money into his PAC. And that's not nothing, but there's two important considerations that we have to keep in mind with PACs. The PACs can do a lot, and we have some very effective PACs on the Democratic side, but they're somewhat hamstrung in the kind of messaging that they can present. It's not always driving home the message to vote for this candidate in that way.
We don't have those constraints.
Right. But they also have to pay more. Keep in mind that the rates that the candidates get much lower rates in advertising for the most part than PACs, meaning you have to raise, 4-to-1, 5-to-1 in so-called soft money, what candidates raise just to be able to get the same sort of efficiency in a media buy. So it certainly wouldn't be the Republican Party's best first choice in terms of how they're raising money right now. But they're doing everything they can, obviously selling Bibles and
So Tom, we're coming up toward the end here. There was one more question in Q&A just about North Carolina. I don't know if you're tracking the North Carolina data, but
yeah,
just on the Biden and the presidential in North Carolina.
I'm a believer in North Carolina as the next Georgia. I've done work in Georgia for the last decade. The different elements there, significant population of voters of color, with the opportunity to mobilize and increase turnout. When you look at the white voters in the state, having a base of higher educated voters, which you do have in North Carolina, and then having the organization and structure. And I really give a lot of credit to the reasonably new Democratic Party chair there, who has just done an awesome job of getting out, raising money. I was looking at new registration data there a couple of weeks ago, and one thing that struck me was that the youth voter registration in North Carolina, when you look at the share of new registrants that are under the age of 30, at this point in time, and you compare it to the same point in time in 2022 and 2020, this cycle is outperforming both those cycles in youth voter registration. So certainly a good early sign. They're actually raising money at the party there. You have no shortage of extremist Republicans in North Carolina. And what they have done in the legislature on abortion rights puts them you know, in the extreme end of that as well. So I'm optimistic that North Carolina, and look, it was close in 2020 without significant effort or investment. Not, I mean, certainly people in the state were working hard, but in terms of national organizations and the campaign, it was really minimal investment. I believe you will see the Biden campaign, the DNC, and Democrats in general make a big play at North Carolina, and I would not be surprised to see it go. And as we all know, like when you think of the map, uh, you know, there's a map to 270 that doesn't involve North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. If you win one of those states, any one of those states, it makes it almost impossible for the Trump campaign. So I'm a big fan of organizing and investing in North Carolina, and I believe that we can pull it off.
Nice. I love that.
Try to give a quick shout to Utah. New York Times actually gave our Senate candidate an honorable mention in Senate races last week. So we were very excited about that.
Well, and real quick, I will say the one thing where Utah stands out is when you look at the data and you look at the trend lines, like as you can testify to much better than I, Utah Republicans are not, they don't love Trump.
No,
It was the one state where he underperformed. He underperformed in Utah in 2020, his 2016 performance, I think by more than any other state. And again, you have a highly educated population there, and some more
with
moderate.
Romney gone, there's 12 Republicans running that are trying to out Trumpy each other.
Right.
It is just going batshit crazy here. And then we have a young climate activist who's, you know, is probably not well known nationally, but very well known locally because she's a very famous mountaineer here. And she's actually released a campaign video that had over 500,000 views.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's worth keeping an eye on.
Raised $3 million, and not even Jenny Wilson was able to raise $3 million in her entire run, let alone 3 weeks before convention.
Yeah, certainly worth keeping an eye on, because again, they're not MAGA there like they are elsewhere. It's worth watching.
Some places are, but
yeah, no doubt. You've got some parts of the state that
I guess, yeah. You're a Democrat. Do not go to Duchesne.
Jamie has canvassed those houses. She has talked to those people.
Well, you're here to talk about it, so good for you.
Yes, I've had a gun pulled on me.
I believe it.
And it was very fun. So
all right, well, we're coming up toward the hour here. Everybody, thank you so much. Jamie just dropped the link in the chat to our Reach app. We hope that everybody joins us there. Tom, thank you for your work and for inspiring people to believe, and we will keep following you throughout the 2024 cycle.
And if you guys are not following him on Twitter, I mean,
it's a must.
It's a must. I mean, I have very few accounts on notifications, and I have Tom on notifications because he doesn't overwhelm you with tweets.
That's a lot of pressure for me to hear, by the way. I'm gonna.
But you know, your tweets are so informative.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I love your fights with Nate. They just crack me up. So.
It's both Nates actually that
all the Nates.
Yeah,
all the Nates. But it
thank you so much.
It's a fun little drama with it's not quite so crazy drama. the Trump race.
Try to keep it on substance and towards the goal of making sure that when we talk about polling and electoral trends that we're keeping each other honest and providing the best analysis we can. So I appreciate that. Yeah. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk with y'all and appreciate all the great work y'all do. It's awesome and makes me feel energized being able to talk to y'all. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, man. Appreciate you coming.
Have a good night, guys.
Thanks, everybody.